The heavy glass doors of Hamilton First Bank swung shut behind Julian Carter as he stepped inside, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. The grand chandeliers cast a warm glow over the room, but the air carried an undercurrent of tension. Dressed in a navy suit, Julian approached the counter, handing over a large check with a calm expression. The young teller's eyes widened slightly before she stiffened. "I'll need my manager," she murmured before hurriedly calling over a man in an expensive gray suit. Richard Bowen, the branch manager, arrived with a scrutinizing gaze. He barely glanced at the check before his lips curled slightly. "Sir, I'll need to verify this," he said, his tone sharp. Julian's jaw tightened. "By all means," he replied evenly. But as Bowen took the check and walked toward his office, Julian could already sense what was coming. This wasn't standard procedure. This was something else. Julian Carter stood at the counter, his expression calm but his patience thinning. The hum of quiet conversation in Hamilton First Bank continued as Richard Bowen disappeared into his office with the check. Julian noticed the subtle glances from customers and staff, their eyes flickering toward him before quickly looking away. It was the same look he had seen before: skepticism, doubt, judgment. He exhaled slowly, keeping his composure. He had dealt with situations like this before, but that didn't make it any less insulting. Minutes passed, then 10. Julian checked his watch. There was no reason for a simple verification to take this long. He caught the teller glancing nervously toward Bowen's office, shifting uncomfortably in her seat. Something wasn't right. Finally, the door to Bowen's office swung open, and the manager strode back toward the counter, his face unreadable. He held the check in his hand but made no move to return it. Instead, he crossed his arms, tilting his chin slightly upward. "I'm afraid we won't be able to process this," Bowen said, his voice laced with false authority. Julian narrowed his eyes. "Excuse me?" Bowen sighed, as if he were dealing with a troublesome child. "There are inconsistencies. The amount is quite large, and given the circumstances, we have reason to believe it may not be legitimate." A hush fell over the immediate area. A couple sitting nearby exchanged glances. A man in a business suit frowned but didn't intervene. The tension in the air thickened. Julian kept his voice measured. "You haven't contacted the issuing party, have you?" Bowen smirked slightly. "That won't be necessary." Julian's jaw clenched. "Why is that?" Bowen leaned in just slightly. "Because checks like these don't just land in the hands of, well, just anyone." There it was. The unspoken accusation, the condescending dismissal wrapped in polite professionalism. Julian felt the heat rise in his chest, but he didn't let it show. Instead, he reached for the check, but Bowen held it just out of reach. "Sir, I strongly suggest you try another bank," Bowen said with a smirk. "Somewhere that might be more accommodating." The meaning was clear. A murmur spread through the bank. A woman near the entrance gasped softly. Even the teller behind the counter, who had been silent until now, looked deeply uncomfortable. Julian, however, did not waver. He straightened his shoulders and leveled Bowen with a steady gaze. "Let me make something clear," he said, his voice firm but controlled. "This check is valid. You could have confirmed that with a single phone call, but instead you assumed." Bowen scoffed. "I don't make assumptions, Mr. Carter. I follow protocol." "Protocol?" Julian repeated, a hint of sharp amusement in his tone. "Denying service based on a gut feeling isn't protocol. It's prejudice." Bowen's smirk faltered for the first time. Julian took a step closer, his voice lowering just enough to make Bowen shift uncomfortably. "I'll tell you what's going to happen now. You're going to verify that check the way you should have from the start. Or you're going to regret this conversation more than you can possibly imagine." Bowen let out a small laugh, though it lacked the confidence of before. "Is that supposed to be a threat?" Julian didn't blink. "It's a promise." The tension in the room was suffocating now. More customers were listening. A bank security guard, who had been standing idly by the entrance, straightened slightly, uncertain of whether to intervene. Before Bowen could respond, Julian pulled out his phone, dialing a number with ease. He turned slightly so that his voice would carry across the lobby. "Yes, I need to speak with the regional director immediately." Julian said into the phone, his voice crisp and professional. "It's urgent." Bowen's expression faltered. "Who are you calling?" Julian ignored him. "Yes, I'll hold," Julian continued. He let the silence stretch between them, letting Bowen sit in his discomfort. Customers whispered. The teller shifted uneasily. Even the security guard took a cautious step forward. And then, "Yes," Julian said into the phone, a small smile forming. "Put her on." The bank manager stiffened. "Marianne, it's Julian Carter," he said, his voice carrying. "I'm standing in one of your branches, being refused service on a verified check." Bowen's face drained of color. "Yes," Julian continued smoothly. "No verification attempt. No call made. Just an assumption. I'd like to know how you'd like to handle it." Silence. Then Julian extended the phone toward Bowen. She'd like a word. The bank lobby had never been quieter. Julian Carter held the phone out, his expression calm but unwavering. Richard Bowen hesitated, his eyes darting between Julian and the growing number of spectators in the bank lobby. He could feel the weight of their stares, the hushed murmurs of customers and employees alike. The confidence he had wielded so effortlessly just moments ago now wavered under the crushing realization that he had severely miscalculated. Slowly, with a forced smile, Bowen reached for the phone. His hand was clammy as he pressed it to his ear. "Marianne, hi," he started, his tone shifting from arrogance to nervous politeness. The voice on the other end was sharp, no nonsense. "Richard," Marianne Sinclair, the regional director, said coolly. "What exactly am I hearing? You refuse to verify a check from Julian Carter?" Bowen swallowed hard. "Well, I had concerns about—" "You had concerns?" Marianne cut him off. "Concerns that stopped you from making a simple phone call? Concerns that led you to publicly humiliate one of our most significant clients?" Bowen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Beads of sweat formed on his temple. He cast a desperate glance at Julian, but the man simply raised an eyebrow, arms crossed over his chest. "Do you even know who you're speaking to?" Marianne continued, her voice sharp as a blade. "Julian Carter is not just a client. He is one of the largest shareholders in this institution. He is, in part, your employer." Gasps rippled through the bank. A woman in a beige coat clutched her purse a little tighter. A young man in business attire leaned in, eyes widening. Even the security guard, who had been standing rigidly by the entrance, glanced at Julian with newfound respect. Bowen's face turned ghostly pale. His mind reeled. A shareholder? He had assumed Julian was just another customer, an inconvenient one at that. He had made assumptions based on nothing but personal bias, and now those assumptions were unraveling his career before his very eyes. "Mr. Carter," Marianne said, her voice now loud enough for the room to hear, "I sincerely apologize for this treatment. I assure you this is not the standard of service we uphold." Julian nodded, his expression unreadable. "Apologies are one thing," he said evenly. "Accountability is another." Bowen stiffened. "Believe me, there will be accountability," Marianne said sharply. "Richard, you will hand the phone back to Mr. Carter immediately, and after that, you will step away from that counter." Bowen clenched his jaw, his face twisted with the kind of frustration only a man used to power could understand. But he had lost control of the situation, and he knew it. His fingers gripped the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white before he finally, reluctantly handed it back to Julian. Julian took it smoothly, pressing it back to his ear. "Yes?" "I'll be at that branch within the hour," Marianne said. "But in the meantime, your check will be processed immediately. If there's anything else you require, please don't hesitate to let me know." Julian's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "That'll do for now. Thank you, Marianne." As he ended the call, he turned back to the counter where the young teller stood, wide-eyed, clearly shaken. She scrambled to take the check from Bowen's still trembling hands and rushed to complete the transaction. The hum of the bank resumed, but the energy had shifted. Customers who had quietly watched in silence now looked at Julian with something close to admiration. Meanwhile, Bowen stepped back, shoulders rigid, his usual air of superiority gone. His face burned with humiliation, knowing there was no way to undo what had just happened. Julian took his receipt and check stub, giving the teller a polite nod of thanks. Then, without looking at Bowen, he turned to address the room. "I hope today serves as a reminder," he said, his voice steady, carrying through the bank with an air of authority. "Respect isn't something given based on assumptions. It's the bare minimum every person deserves." With that, Julian adjusted his jacket and walked toward the exit, his presence commanding the space even as he left. The moment the doors swung shut behind him, the entire bank exhaled. But for Richard Bowen, the reckoning was only just beginning. Julian Carter stepped out of the bank, his mind steady but his pulse thrumming with the remnants of frustration. He had expected professionalism, at the very least respect. Instead, he had been treated like an outsider in an institution he partially owned. The weight of that reality settled deep in his chest, but he knew this wasn't the end. Inside the bank, Richard Bowen stood frozen, his world unraveling in front of him. Whispers rippled through the room, employees exchanging wide-eyed glances. The teller who had hesitated earlier looked visibly shaken, as though realizing how close she had come to making the same mistake. Customers shuffled in their seats, some watching Bowen with a mix of pity and curiosity, others staring at the door Julian had just exited with the kind of quiet admiration that came when witnessing justice unfold. Bowen felt his breath hitch. The sinking weight in his gut told him what was coming before it even happened. Then the doors swung open again. Marianne Sinclair entered, her sharp heels clicking against the marble floors with a precision that could cut glass. She carried herself with a presence that commanded attention, her fitted navy blazer tailored to perfection, her expression unreadable. Two other senior executives trailed behind her, their faces stern. The energy in the room shifted instantly. Conversations died, and even the security guard straightened his posture. Bowen swallowed hard. "Mr. Bowen." Marianne's voice was cool and cutting, each syllable crisp and deliberate. "My office, now." The words landed like a gavel strike. Bowen nodded stiffly, the color draining from his face. He could feel the weight of every eye in the room boring into him. Without a word, he turned and walked toward the back office, his once confident stride now reduced to something stiff, forced. The glass-paneled office offered no privacy. Employees peered in through the reflections on the glass as Marianne closed the door behind her. She folded her arms, exhaling sharply as she regarded him with barely concealed contempt. "Tell me exactly what happened." Her tone left no room for maneuvering. Bowen fumbled for words, his usual arrogance nowhere to be found. I followed protocol. The check amount was large and don't insult my intelligence." Marianne's voice was flat, unyielding. "You didn't follow protocol. You disregarded it. Instead of verifying the check, you made a personal judgment, and you humiliated a man who happens to be one of our most valuable shareholders." Bowen felt his throat go dry. Marianne continued, her voice rising slightly. "This isn't just about Julian Carter. It's about what this represents. If that had been someone else, someone without the resources or power that Mr. Carter has, what would have happened? Would they have simply walked away, humiliated, with no one to defend them? Would they have been treated with the same level of disrespect simply because you didn't think they belonged in this bank?" Bowen opened his mouth, but no words came. He had no defense. Outside the office, the staff watched the exchange with bated breath. No one dared to move, no one dared to interrupt. They had all seen what had happened. They had all heard the condescension in Bowen's voice, the arrogance dripping from every word he had spoken to Julian, and now they were witnessing his downfall in real time. Marianne exhaled, shaking her head in disappointment. "You have placed this institution in a position of public scrutiny. You have damaged our reputation, and most importantly, you have compromised the trust our clients have in us. Effective immediately, you are relieved of your duties as branch manager." Bowen flinched as though struck. "Wait," he sputtered. "Marianne, please, I've been with this bank for over 15 years. And in that time, how many others have you treated this way?" Marianne's voice was sharp. "How many clients have walked out of this bank feeling like they didn't belong?" Bowen had no answer. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Then finally, Marianne spoke again, her voice quieter but no less firm. "Pack your things. Security will escort you out. Bowen's hands trembled as he turned toward the door. When he stepped out of the office, the entire room seemed to still. His eyes darted around, but no one met his gaze. Employees turned away, customers averted their eyes. The teller he had spoken to earlier clutched her pen tightly, as though gripping onto something tangible in the face of discomfort. Then, the final humiliation. Security approached, ready to walk him out like a common criminal. Bowen swallowed his pride, squared his shoulders, and walked toward the exit, each step echoing like a death knell to his career. As the doors shut behind him, the entire bank exhaled. Marianne turned back to the employees, scanning their faces one by one. "Let this be a lesson," she said, her voice carrying across the room. "Bias has no place in this institution. Professionalism, integrity, and respect. These are non-negotiable." With that, she walked toward the front counter where Julian Carter's transaction had been left unfinished. She reached for the check, nodding toward the teller. "Finish processing this," she said, her voice softer now. "Properly." The teller, still shaken but resolute, nodded. "Yes, ma'am." As the weight of the moment settled, one thing was clear. This wasn't just about a single check. This was about the kind of culture they chose to uphold. And today, change had arrived, unyielding and undeniable. The air inside Crownstone Bank remained heavy, even after Richard Bowen's departure. Employees exchanged uneasy glances, customers whispered among themselves, and the tension that had filled the room earlier refused to fade. But one man remained unfazed, Julian Carter. Dressed in his navy blue suit, he stood near the counter, his expression composed but his presence undeniable. He had seen situations like this before, moments when bias and prejudice were laid bare for all to witness, but this time he wasn't going to let it slide. This wasn't just about him, it was about every person who had ever been dismissed, doubted, or degraded, based on nothing but assumptions. As Bowen's absence left a void in the room, Julian turned toward Marianne Sinclair, the senior executive who had swiftly taken charge of the situation. Her sharp gaze met his, and without hesitation, she stepped forward. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice now carrying an air of quiet professionalism, though the undercurrent of tension remained. "On behalf of Crownstone Bank, I sincerely apologize for what just transpired." Julian studied her, noting the sincerity in her words, but also the lingering discomfort in her eyes. She knew the damage that had been done, and she knew it extended beyond a single transaction. "I appreciate that," Julian responded, his voice steady. "But an apology isn't enough. This is bigger than me. What happened here today is likely not an isolated incident. How many others have been turned away? How many people left this bank feeling humiliated simply because someone decided they didn't belong?" Marianne stiffened slightly. The murmurs in the bank grew quieter. Julian wasn't just here to collect an apology. He was holding them accountable. "I agree," she said, nodding firmly. "And that's why we will be conducting a full internal review of our policies and employee conduct. This should never have happened, and it will not happen again." Julian tilted his head slightly. "A review is a good start, but let's be honest. Corporate reviews often end in written statements and little action. I want something real, something concrete. What do you plan to do about the culture that allowed this to happen?" Marianne hesitated, but only for a second. She wasn't accustomed to being challenged so directly, but she recognized the weight of the moment. "We will be implementing mandatory bias training for all employees, effective immediately. Furthermore, we will be launching an external oversight committee to address discrimination complaints. Mr. Carter, we don't take this lightly." Julian nodded slowly, processing her words. The customers and employees continued to watch, riveted. "Good," he said finally. "But I want to make one thing clear. This isn't just about ensuring fairness for clients. Your employees need to understand that assumptions like the one Bowen made today don't just cost the bank a customer. They cost trust, reputation, loyalty. The people watching today, the ones who saw what happened, they won't forget it." A few customers nodded in agreement. One elderly man near the front murmured, "He's right." Marianne inhaled deeply, then turned to the teller who had been involved in the initial transaction. "Finish processing Mr. Carter's check." she instructed. Without delay. The young woman nodded quickly and got to work. Meanwhile, Marianne shifted her focus back to Julian. There is one more thing, she said carefully. Mr. Bowen was a high-ranking manager, but we both know bias isn't confined to one person. I would like to extend an invitation to you. Julian arched a brow. An invitation? To join our new advisory panel, she explained. We need voices like yours at the table. If we're going to change things, we need insight from people who have experienced discrimination firsthand. A hush fell over the bank. This wasn't just a hollow gesture. This was an acknowledgement that something deeper needed to shift. Julian considered her offer. He hadn't come here looking for a fight, nor had he expected to be offered a role in fixing the problem. But then again, maybe that was exactly why he had to accept. All right, he said after a moment. I'll be involved, but let me be clear. I'm not here for empty promises. If I see that this is just another corporate formality, I won't hesitate to call it out. Marianne offered a small, knowing smile. That's exactly why we need you, Mr. Carter. As the teller slid the processed check across the counter, Julian took it, glancing down at the slip of paper that had sparked so much chaos. But as he pocketed it, he knew. This was never about a check. This was about changing the way people were seen, valued, and respected. With one final glance at the room, Julian Carter turned and walked toward the doors, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. But this time, the silence wasn't just uncomfortable. It was reflective. And no one in that bank would ever see their job the same way again. As Julian Carter stepped out of Crownstone Bank and into the warm Nashville afternoon, he exhaled slowly, the weight of the encounter still lingering in his chest. He had been in plenty of boardrooms and business meetings where people underestimated him, but today had been different. Today, it wasn't just about proving himself, it was about proving something bigger. He walked toward his sleek black car parked just down the street, but before he could reach for the handle, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, unknown number. Julian hesitated for only a second before answering. This is Carter. A deep, authoritative voice greeted him. Mr. Carter, this is Douglas Shaw, chairman of Crownstone Bank's executive board. I believe we need to talk. Julian smirked slightly, adjusting his cufflinks. He had expected a call, but not this soon. I'd say so, Mr. Shaw. Your institution has a problem, and I don't think a simple apology is going to fix it. Shaw let out a measured breath. That's exactly why I'm calling. I was made aware of the situation at our downtown branch, and let me assure you, this is not the kind of culture we want in our institution. Then you have a lot of work to do, Julian replied. What happened today wasn't an isolated incident. It was a reflection of a deeper issue. Shaw was silent for a moment. Then his tone shifted. I want to meet with you, in person, tomorrow morning. Let's discuss how we move forward. Julian considered the offer. He had no interest in sitting through another corporate damage control meeting. But then again, if real change was possible, wasn't it his responsibility to push for it? All right, Julian said. But let me be clear, Mr. Shaw. I don't do meetings just for show. If you're calling me in to smooth things over and sweep this under the rug, don't waste my time. Shaw chuckled lightly. I think you'll find I'm not in the habit of wasting anyone's time, Mr. Carter. I'll see you at 9 a.m. The call ended, and Julian stared at the phone for a moment. He had played this game before, corporate executives scrambling to save face, promising changes they never intended to make. But this time, something felt different. The next morning, Julian arrived at Crownstone Bank's headquarters, a towering glass building in the heart of the city. A receptionist led him through a series of polished hallways before finally escorting him into a large, sunlit conference room. Douglas Shaw stood by the window, a tall man in his 60s with silver hair and the air of someone who had seen and survived it all. He turned as Julian entered, extending a hand. Mr. Carter, thank you for coming. Julian shook his hand, his grip firm. Let's get to it. They sat across from each other at the long conference table, the tension in the room thick but controlled. Shaw leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. I'll be honest with you, Mr. Carter. What happened yesterday was unacceptable. We pride ourselves on being a forward-thinking institution, but clearly there are blind spots. Julian raised an eyebrow. Blind spots? That's one way to put it. Let's be real, Mr. Shaw. What happened yesterday was more than a mistake. It was a culture in action. Shaw nodded slowly. And that's why I want your help in changing it. Julian narrowed his eyes slightly. My help? Yes, Shaw said, leaning forward. We're implementing immediate reforms, bias training, an internal review of complaints, and a restructuring of our leadership training. But I want you involved. We need a voice from the outside. Someone who won't hesitate to tell us when we're failing. Julian studied him carefully. And what exactly are you offering? Shaw slid a folder across the table. A position on our external advisory board, full transparency, real oversight, and the power to influence policy changes within the bank. Julian picked up the folder, flipping through the contents. The offer was real. This wasn't just lip service. It was an invitation to be at the table where decisions were made. He set the folder down. This isn't just about me, he said. I'll do it, but under one condition. Shaw raised an eyebrow. Name it. Julian leaned forward. You don't just implement changes inside this bank. You take it to the public. Community investment. Financial literacy programs for underserved neighborhoods. You don't just fix your image, you fix the system. Shaw smiled, a slow nod of approval. I like the way you think, Mr. Carter. Julian extended his hand. Then let's make it happen. As they shook hands, Julian knew this wasn't just about proving a point anymore. It was about building something better for everyone. The morning sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the Crown Point Bank headquarters, casting a golden glow over the sleek conference room. Julian Carter sat at the table, his hands clasped, his expression steady yet thoughtful. Across from him, Douglas Shaw, the chairman, leaned forward, his face marked with a rare sincerity. Mr. Carter, Shaw said, his voice measured, yesterday we failed you. But more than that, we failed the very values we claim to uphold. We don't want this to be another corporate apology. We want real change. Julian exhaled, his fingers tapping lightly against the polished wood. Change isn't just a press release, Mr. Shaw. It's action. It's showing up in communities that have been overlooked, ensuring that no one walks into your bank and leaves feeling less than human. Shaw nodded. That's why we're asking you to help us do exactly that. For a moment, Julian thought back to the people in that branch, the young teller who had looked away, the customers who had remained silent. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for every person who had ever been dismissed, underestimated, or turned away. He met Shaw's gaze and nodded. All right, he said. But if I do this, we do it right. And just like that, the first step toward something greater had begun. In 2025, this story serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of challenging bias and fostering accountability in all institutions. With technology advancing and financial systems becoming more automated, human judgment still plays a crucial role in customer service. The lesson here is clear. Respect and fairness should never be based on assumptions. Companies must implement stronger diversity training, enforce accountability, and ensure that every client is treated with dignity. As society moves forward, we must continue advocating for transparency and equal treatment, proving that progress isn't just about innovation. It's about changing the way we see and treat each other.